Hey guys, tonight we begin with some of the biggest lies, myths, and misunderstandings that still cling to ancient Greece, like olive oil on a philosopher's toga. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people think of ancient Greece, one image usually marches straight into their minds. A Spartan warrior standing heroically on a battlefield, muscles gleaming in the sun, shield raised, ready to defeat an entire army through discipline, courage, and what Hollywood would later determine was a severe shortage of shirts. According to popular culture, Spartans were essentially the ancient world's version of superheroes. They never retreated, never lost, never doubted themselves, and apparently spent every waking moment preparing for battle while delivering inspirational one-liners. The reality, as usual, is far less cinematic and considerably more human. There is no question that Sparta possessed one of the most respected military systems in ancient Greece. Spartan boys entered a demanding educational and military training program known as the agoge. From an early age, they were taught discipline, endurance, obedience, and survival skills. Life was intentionally difficult. Comfort was treated almost like a dangerous enemy. If a modern parent enrolled their child in the agoge today, social services would arrive before lunchtime. This training produced highly capable soldiers, and Spartan armies earned a reputation that intimidated rivals throughout Greece. But somewhere along the way, highly effective soldiers transformed into unbeatable warrior gods. History tends to do that. One of the main reasons is the famous Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. Most people know the basic story. King Leonidas and a small Greek force held a narrow mountain pass against the invading Persian army. The Spartans fought bravely, refused to surrender, and became symbols of courage for generations. It is an incredible story. It is also a story about losing. The Persians won. This detail often gets quietly escorted out of the room whenever Thermopylae is discussed. The battle became so legendary that many people remember the heroism while forgetting the outcome. It is one of the few military defeats that managed to secure a better public relations campaign than many victories. And Thermopylae was hardly Sparta's only battle. The Spartans lost wars. They lost campaigns. They lost individual battles. Most importantly, they lost their position as Greece's dominant military power. In 371 BC, the city-state of Thebes defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra. The Theban commander Epaminondas used innovative tactics that completely disrupted Spartan expectations. This was deeply inconvenient for a society whose entire brand revolved around being unbeatable. The defeat shocked the Greek world. For generations, people had assumed Spartan armies could not be overcome in open battle. Suddenly, they had been overcome quite thoroughly. Adding to Sparta's difficulties was a problem they could never fully solve. Their society depended on a large population of helots, an enslaved class that greatly outnumbered Spartan citizens. The Spartans spent enormous amounts of time worrying about revolts and maintaining control. Imagine building the most feared military state in Greece, only to spend much of your energy nervously checking whether your workforce was planning to overthrow you. The truth is that Sparta was impressive enough without the exaggerations. Its soldiers were disciplined, its military culture was unique, and its influence was enormous. But the Spartans were not invincible. They were not superhuman. They were not undefeated. They were simply very skilled warriors who happened to acquire one of the greatest marketing campaigns in human history. A campaign that has been running successfully for about 2,500 years. That kind of longevity would make even the Spartans proud. If there is one achievement that ancient Greece proudly claims as a gift to the modern world, it is democracy. Ask almost anyone what Athens is famous for, and somewhere near the top of the list, you'll hear the phrase, birthplace of democracy. It sounds impressive. Noble citizens gathering together, debating important issues, voting on laws, and shaping the future of their society through reasoned discussion. And to be fair, that did happen. The catch is that the word citizens was doing an extraordinary amount of work. When people hear the term democracy today, they usually imagine a system where most adults have the right to vote. Ancient Athens had a rather different interpretation. Athenian democracy allowed participation only to adult male citizens born to citizen parents. Women could not vote. Foreign residents could not vote. Slaves could not vote. Children could not vote. As a result, a large percentage of the population had absolutely no political voice whatsoever. Imagine announcing that everyone is invited to a feast, then revealing that everyone actually refers to a surprisingly specific guest list. Yet within those limits, Athenian democracy was genuinely revolutionary. Unlike many neighbouring societies ruled by kings, tyrants, or aristocrats, Athens allowed eligible citizens to vote directly on important issues. Thousands could gather in assemblies to debate laws, military campaigns, taxes, and foreign policy. In theory, ordinary citizens had significant influence over government decisions. In practice, things were sometimes messier. Political debates could become emotional, personal, and chaotic. Popular speakers often swayed crowds with charisma rather than wisdom. Citizens occasionally voted for policies they later regretted. Sometimes they even voted to exile politicians they disliked. For 10 years, through a process called ostracism, Athenians could write a person's name on a pottery shard and collectively send them away from the city. It was essentially democracy mixed with a very large public grudge. Some historians jokingly describe it as ancient social media, except the consequences were considerably more dramatic. Even famous figures were not immune. Successful generals, influential politicians, and respected leaders could suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of public opinion. Despite its flaws, Athenian democracy was a remarkable experiment. It introduced ideas about citizenship, participation, and political accountability that would influence governments for centuries. But the popular image of a fully inclusive democratic paradise simply isn't accurate. Ancient Athens helped invent democracy. It just hadn't yet figured out the part where nearly everyone gets a vote. That particular upgrade would take another couple of thousand years. History, much like government bureaucracy, occasionally moves at a leisurely pace. Today, when we think of Greek philosophers, we often picture wise old men calmly discussing the meaning of life, while everyone around them listens with admiration and takes careful notes. Ancient Greece itself tells a different story. Many philosophers were respected, certainly. Some attracted devoted students and gained influence across the Greek world. But others were viewed as irritating troublemakers, dangerous thinkers, or people with entirely too much free time. Take Socrates, perhaps the most famous philosopher in history. Modern textbooks often present him as a symbol of wisdom and reason. Yet many Athenians found him deeply annoying. His favourite hobby seems to have been walking up to people, asking difficult questions, exposing flaws in their arguments, and then asking even more questions. Imagine spending years building a reputation as an expert on something, only for a barefoot man in the marketplace to politely dismantle your entire worldview before lunch. Not surprisingly, this did not make him universally popular. Socrates questioned politicians, craftsmen, poets, and public figures. He challenged assumptions and encouraged people to think critically about ideas they had always accepted. While some admired him, others saw him as a threat to social order. Eventually, Athens put him on trial. The charges included corrupting the youth and disrespecting traditional religious beliefs. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. The most famous philosopher in Greek history did not receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. He received poison. That alone should tell us that philosophers were not always cherished members of society. Nor was Socrates unique. Many intellectuals found themselves caught in political controversies. The philosopher Anaxagoras was accused of impiety. Protagoras faced hostility for questioning traditional religious ideas. Aristotle himself eventually fled Athens after the death of Alexander the Great. According to tradition, Aristotle explained that he wanted to prevent Athens from sinning twice against philosophy, a reference to the execution of Socrates. In other words, he saw the warning signs and decided that discretion was the better part of staying alive. Even famous philosophers who avoided legal trouble often became targets of jokes. The playwright Aristophanes famously mocked intellectuals in his comedies. Philosophers were portrayed as eccentric, impractical, and disconnected from reality. Some stereotypes have impressive longevity. One philosopher, Diogenes, embraced the criticism so completely that he reportedly lived in a large storage jar, insulted powerful people, and wandered around carrying a lamp in daylight looking for an honest man. To be fair, if you spend your afternoon searching for honesty in politics, people may assume you're conducting philosophy. The truth is that ancient Greece loved ideas, but it did not always love the people presenting them. Philosophers helped shape Western thought, yet many spent their lives arguing, offending, provoking, and occasionally fleeing. In short, they were intellectual celebrities, and like many celebrities, they were often admired right up until the moment they became inconvenient. If you've ever walked through a museum filled with ancient Greek statues, you've probably noticed something. They're all very white marble faces, white marble bodies, white marble heroes staring nobly into the distance as if they have spent the last 2,000 years contemplating important philosophical questions. This has led many people to believe that the ancient Greeks deliberately created their art in pure white marble because they considered it the height of beauty and sophistication. There's only one problem. They didn't. In reality, most Greek statues were painted, brightly painted, painfully brightly painted in some cases. The statues that survive today have lost most of their original colours after centuries of exposure to weather, sunlight, moisture, and human beings doing what human beings do best, accidentally destroying historical evidence. When archaeologists began examining statues closely, they discovered tiny traces of pigments still clinging to the stone. Advanced imaging techniques later revealed that many sculptures had originally been covered in vivid reds, blues, greens, yellows, and golds. Some even featured detailed patterns on clothing, painted eyes, colourful hair, and decorative accessories. In other words, ancient Greek statues often looked less like elegant museum pieces and more like expensive luxury collectibles. If you could magically transport one into a modern art gallery, many visitors would probably assume it belonged in a toy convention. This revelation shocked scholars when it first gained widespread attention. For centuries, people had built entire artistic movements around the idea of pure white Greek sculpture. During the Renaissance and later the neoclassical period, artists admired what they believed was the Greeks' preference for clean, uncoloured marble. The irony is almost impressive. European artists spent hundreds of years copying a version of Greek art that had accidentally lost most of its paint. The Greeks themselves would likely have been confused by the misunderstanding. Imagine painting your house bright blue, only for future generations to discover it after the paint has faded away and conclude that you were passionately devoted to plain concrete. The colours served important purposes. They made details easier to see, highlighted clothing and armour, emphasised facial features, and brought religious statues to life. Temples were colourful too, often decorated with painted sculptures and vibrant architectural details. Ancient Greece was not the world of endless white stone that many people imagine. It was colourful. Very colourful. Perhaps uncomfortably colourful for some modern tastes. The biggest lesson here is that history often survives in fragments. What we see today is not always what people saw at the time. The ancient Greeks lived in a world bursting with colour, but after 2,000 years, most of that colour quietly disappeared. The myth remained. The paint did not. When modern films portray ancient Greece, the casting often follows a familiar formula. Everyone is tall. Everyone is handsome. Everyone possesses perfect hair despite lacking modern shampoo. And everyone seems to spend their free time training for a statue competition. The result is an image of ancient Greece populated almost entirely by athletic supermodels who occasionally paused their beauty routines long enough to invent philosophy. Reality, unsurprisingly, was more diverse. Ancient Greece was not a single unified country. It was a collection of independent city-states scattered across the Mediterranean and Aegean worlds. Greek communities stretched from mainland Greece to islands, coastal Asia Minor, southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and beyond. Merchants, sailors, soldiers, diplomats, and settlers moved constantly throughout these regions. As a result, the Greek world was connected to an enormous network of peoples and cultures. Athenians looked different from Spartans. Islanders looked different from mainland Greeks. Greeks living in Egypt often had different experiences from Greeks living along the Black Sea. Even within the same city, people came from a variety of backgrounds. Ancient writers themselves occasionally commented on physical differences between populations. They understood perfectly well that people from different regions did not all look identical. The modern image of a single Greek appearance is largely a later invention. Part of the confusion comes from Greek art. Statues often depict idealized human forms rather than ordinary people. Sculptors wanted to represent perfection, not necessarily reality. Muscles were enhanced. Features were refined. Bodies were proportioned according to artistic ideals. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of heavily edited social media photos. If archaeologists 2,000 years from now judged modern humanity entirely from fitness advertisements, they might conclude that every person spends 6 hours a day exercising and never eats an entire pizza alone. History would be deeply mistaken. Ancient Greek writers were actually aware of this tendency toward idealization. Philosophers frequently discussed beauty, perfection, and the relationship between appearance and reality. The statues represented aspirations as much as observations. Meanwhile, ordinary Greeks were busy dealing with ordinary problems. They worked farms, they ran shops, they argued with neighbours, they worried about taxes, they suffered injuries, illnesses, and all the other inconveniences associated with being human. Most did not resemble Achilles stepping out of a heroic painting. The broader lesson is an important one. Ancient Greece was not a civilization populated by identical philosopher-athletes carved from marble. It was a vibrant, complex world, filled with different communities, different appearances, and different ways of life. The Greeks gave us many remarkable ideas, The notion that everyone looked like a modern movie star was not one of them. That contribution belongs entirely to the film industry, which has never met a historical figure it couldn't improve with better lighting. When people think about the Olympic Games today, they often imagine athletes from around the world gathering in the spirit of friendship, unity, and healthy competition. Ancient Greeks would have recognized the competition part. The rest might have puzzled them. The original Olympic Games were certainly prestigious. Winning at Olympia brought enormous honor to both the athlete and their city-state. Victors could become local celebrities, receive valuable rewards, enjoy public recognition, and have their names remembered for generations. What they did not receive was a silver medal for trying their best. Ancient Greek athletics were intensely competitive. The goal was simple: win, not finish second, not achieve a personal best, not participate for the experience. Win. In fact, only first place truly mattered. There were no gold, silver, and bronze medals. If you came second, history generally responded with a polite shrug and moved on. This created an environment where athletes trained obsessively. Many competitors spent years preparing for a single opportunity at Olympic glory. Training required strict discipline, specialized diets, and relentless practice. Professional coaches existed. Wealthy sponsors supported promising athletes. Entire city-states invested prestige in successful competitors. The pressure was enormous. Imagine spending 4 years preparing for an event where the difference between first place and second place was the difference between becoming a legend and becoming a footnote. Naturally, some people looked for shortcuts. Cheating was a recurring problem. Athletes were caught bribing opponents, bribing officials, and violating competition rules. The Greeks were passionate about fair competition, but they were also human, which unfortunately has always complicated matters. When athletes were caught cheating, they could receive heavy fines. Some of that money was used to build bronze statues that publicly shamed the offenders. Imagine getting caught breaking the rules and having the punishment include funding your own permanent embarrassment. It was surprisingly efficient. The events themselves could be brutal. Boxing had no weight classes. The pancration, a popular combat sport, combined wrestling and boxing into something that looked alarmingly close to organized chaos. Almost anything was permitted except biting and eye gouging. Apparently, the Greeks believed there had to be standards somewhere. Serious injuries were common. Broken bones happened. Knockouts happened. Occasionally, athletes died during competition. This was not exactly a family fun run. Even spectators could become involved in disputes. Rivalries between city-states were intense, and emotions sometimes boiled over into arguments, accusations, and conflicts. The Olympic Games were magnificent events that united the Greek world through shared traditions, but they were not peaceful festivals filled with gentle sportsmanship and mutual encouragement. They were high-stakes competitions where fame, honour, and civic pride were on the line. The athletes came to Olympia seeking glory. The friendship part was mostly a bonus, if it happened at all. If modern popular culture were our only source of information, we might conclude that ancient Greece consisted of exactly 2 places: Athens and Sparta. Everyone else apparently spent centuries standing quietly off camera, waiting for the famous cities to finish making history. The reality was considerably more crowded. Ancient Greece was made up of hundreds of city-states, known as polis. Each had its own government, traditions, ambitions, and rivalries. Some were powerful naval centres. Others dominated trade routes. Some became military powers. Others grew wealthy through commerce and industry. Many played major roles in shaping Greek history, yet most receive little attention today. Take Corinth, for example. Located on a narrow strip of land connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, Corinth occupied one of the most strategically valuable positions in the Greek world. Merchants travelling by land or sea often passed through the city, bringing wealth from across the Mediterranean. Corinth became one of the richest cities in Greece. Its influence stretched far beyond its borders. Ancient visitors often described it as prosperous, busy, and filled with opportunities. In modern terms, it was something like a major international commercial hub, except with more temples and fewer parking problems. Then there was Thebes. Today, many people know Thebes primarily because it appears in Greek myths involving Oedipus, Antigone, and a truly impressive amount of family drama. Historically, however, Thebes became one of the most powerful military states in Greece. In 371 BC, Theban forces defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra, ending centuries of Spartan dominance. The victory shocked the Greek world. Imagine spending generations building a reputation as the toughest military force alive, only to discover that another Greek city had not received the memo. Thebes briefly became the leading power in Greece. Not bad for a city that often gets treated like a supporting character. Far to the west, Syracuse emerged as one of the most important Greek cities in Sicily. It grew wealthy, powerful, and influential enough to challenge major rivals throughout the Mediterranean. At times, Syracuse was larger and richer than many cities on the Greek mainland. Yet modern discussions of ancient Greece often skip past it entirely. Even smaller city-states contributed to Greek culture, philosophy, science, politics, and warfare. Their histories intertwined through alliances, rivalries, trade agreements, and conflicts that lasted for generations. The truth is that ancient Greece was never a simple story about Athens and Sparta. It was a complicated network of competing cities, each convinced it was the centre of civilization, which, if we're being fair, is a remarkably Greek attitude. The famous cities deserve their reputation. They just weren't alone in making history. Their neighbours had plenty to say about that, usually quite loudly. If Hollywood has taught the world anything about ancient Greece, it is apparently this. Every Greek citizen owned a spotless white toga. They spent their days standing around marble buildings, discussing philosophy, and somehow keeping those white garments perfectly clean, despite living in a dusty, ancient city filled with animals, markets, workshops, and people. This image is so common that many people are surprised to learn the Greeks weren't actually the toga-wearing civilization. That was Rome. The toga was a distinctly Roman garment, not a Greek one. Ancient Greeks had their own styles of clothing, and they looked quite different. The most common garment was the chiton, a tunic-like piece of clothing usually made from linen or wool. Men and women wore different versions depending on fashion, social status, and local customs. Over the chiton, people often wore a himation, a large cloak that could be wrapped around the body in various ways. The clothing was practical, adaptable, and suitable for the Mediterranean climate. It was also colourful. There is that inconvenient colour problem again. Just as Greek statues were originally painted, Greek clothing was often dyed using natural pigments. Reds, yellows, blues, greens, and purples could all be found throughout the Greek world. Wealthier citizens often displayed their status through higher quality fabrics and more expensive dyes. The average Greek citizen did not spend every day dressed like an extra in a black and white film, nor did everyone dress the same. Clothing varied significantly depending on location, profession, wealth, age, and occasion. A farmer working in the fields wore something very different from a wealthy Athenian politician attending a public assembly. This may sound obvious, but popular culture occasionally gives the impression that entire civilizations received a single approved outfit. Ancient life was rarely that organized. If you asked an ancient Greek where to find the most reliable advice in the world, many would have pointed you toward the Oracle of Delphi. Located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the sanctuary of Apollo attracted visitors from across the Greek world and beyond. Kings, generals, politicians, merchants, and ordinary citizens all made the journey hoping to receive divine guidance. The oracle's reputation was extraordinary. People consulted her before wars, before founding colonies, before major political decisions, before important personal choices. Essentially, if something mattered, someone eventually asked Delphi about it. Modern retellings often present the oracle as a supernatural figure who delivered precise predictions about the future. The actual experience was usually much less straightforward. One of the most famous examples involved Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia. Before attacking the Persian Empire, Croesus sent messengers to Delphi to ask whether he should go to war. The oracle reportedly answered that if he crossed the river and attacked, a great empire would be destroyed. This sounded promising, so Croesus invaded. The prediction came true. A great empire was destroyed. Unfortunately for Croesus, it was his own. This story perfectly illustrates why Delphi maintained such an impressive reputation for accuracy. Many prophecies were vague enough to accommodate multiple outcomes. If events unfolded one way, the prophecy seemed correct. If events unfolded another way, the prophecy still seemed correct. It was a remarkably durable business model. Modern politicians occasionally look at this strategy with admiration. The oracle herself, known as the Pythia, served as Apollo's priestess. During ceremonies, she delivered responses that priests then interpreted and communicated to visitors. Exactly how the process worked remains debated by historians. Ancient accounts describe mysterious rituals, sacred ceremonies, and altered states of consciousness. Some scholars have even suggested that natural gases rising from geological faults may have played a role in the oracle's experiences. Others remain skeptical. What everyone agrees on is that the sanctuary became one of the most influential religious centres in the ancient world. Importantly, visitors did not simply receive answers to factual questions. The responses often required interpretation. Lots of interpretation. In some cases, entire political debates emerged over what a prophecy actually meant. Imagine receiving guidance so ambiguous that you needed a committee meeting just to understand your fortune. Yet people continued to trust Delphi for centuries. Part of this was religious faith, part was tradition, and part was the oracle's remarkable ability to offer advice that remained relevant regardless of what happened next. The truth is that Delphi was not a magical prediction machine delivering crystal-clear forecasts of the future. It was a religious institution operating in a world filled with uncertainty. And perhaps that explains its success. After all, humans have never stopped searching for answers. We've merely upgraded from mountain sanctuaries to internet comment sections, with results that are not necessarily more reliable. Ancient Greece gave the world some genuinely important medical advances. Greek physicians observed symptoms, recorded cases, studied the human body, and searched for natural explanations for disease rather than automatically blaming angry gods or evil spirits. Compared to many earlier approaches, this was a remarkable step forward. But before we start imagining modern hospitals filled with stethoscopes and medical degrees, we should remember one important fact. They were still guessing. A lot. The most famous Greek physician was Hippocrates, whose name survives today in the Hippocratic Oath taken by many doctors. He encouraged careful observation and professional standards, helping medicine become a more systematic field. This was excellent. The problem was that ancient doctors lacked a detailed understanding of anatomy, bacteria, viruses, genetics, or virtually anything that modern medicine relies upon. As a result, they often built impressive theories upon foundations that were completely wrong. One of the most influential ideas was the theory of the four humours. According to this belief, the human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on maintaining the proper balance between them. If you became sick, doctors assumed one or more humours had fallen out of balance. This sounds reasonable until you realise nobody actually knew what black bile was. Even ancient writers struggled to explain it clearly, yet for centuries, physicians treated countless patients based on this theory. The prescribed treatments could be unusual. If doctors believed you had too much blood, they might recommend bloodletting. If they suspected an imbalance in another humour, they could prescribe special diets, purges, vomiting, fasting, or various herbal remedies. Some treatments probably helped, others almost certainly did not, and a few likely made patients wonder whether the disease had been the safer option. Greek doctors also paid close attention to lifestyle. They believed exercise, diet, sleep, climate, and daily habits affected health. In this regard, they were often surprisingly insightful. Many recommendations involving moderation and physical activity still sound sensible today. Then again, some medical advice was less timeless. Ancient physicians frequently disagreed with one another, proposed competing theories, and argued over treatments. In fairness, modern doctors also disagree sometimes. The difference is that modern debates generally involve laboratories, rather than discussions about excess phlegm. Despite their mistakes, Greek physicians deserve considerable credit. They helped move medicine away from pure superstition and toward observation and reasoning. That was a major achievement. The truth is that ancient medicine occupied an uncomfortable middle ground between science and speculation. The Greeks were asking many of the right questions, but they lacked the tools needed to find the right answers. Progress had begun. It just had a very long journey ahead. And unfortunately for many patients, that journey occasionally involved being bled, purged, and handed a questionable herbal drink before being sent home. Ask someone to name a famous figure from ancient Greece, and there is a very good chance the answer will be Alexander the Great. It's not difficult to understand why. By the age of 30, Alexander had conquered one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. His armies marched from Greece to Egypt, through Persia, and all the way to the edges of India. His achievements were so extraordinary that even his enemies often admired him. Few historical figures have earned the title the Great quite so convincingly. But there is a downside to Alexander's enormous reputation. He tends to overshadow nearly everyone else. Modern discussions of ancient Greece sometimes create the impression that thousands of years of Greek history were simply leading up to Alexander's arrival, after which everyone collectively agreed that history had reached its peak. The actual Greeks might have objected to this interpretation. After all, Greek civilization had already been producing remarkable individuals for centuries before Alexander was even born. Consider Solon, the Athenian lawmaker whose reforms helped lay the foundations for democracy, or Pericles, whose leadership guided Athens during much of its golden age. Without Pericles, many of the achievements we associate with classical Athens might never have happened. Then there was Socrates, whose questions transformed philosophy. His student Plato established one of history's most influential schools of thought. Plato's student Aristotle went on to study subjects ranging from biology to politics to ethics. At this point, ancient Greek education starts to resemble a remarkably successful referral program. Beyond philosophy, there were scientists and inventors, Archimedes developed mathematical principles that still astonish people today. Hipparchus made groundbreaking contributions to astronomy. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with surprising accuracy, using little more than observation, geometry, and an impressive amount of confidence. Meanwhile, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides created works that are still performed more than 2,000 years later. Most writers would be pleased if people remembered their work for 2 years. These men achieved 2 millennia. Even in warfare, Alexander was not alone. Themistocles played a crucial role in defeating the Persian invasion. Leonidas became a symbol of resistance. Epaminondas revolutionized military tactics and defeated Sparta at its peak. The truth is that ancient Greece was filled with extraordinary individuals long before Alexander arrived and long after he died. Alexander deserves his fame. But Greek history is not a one-man show. It is a vast collection of thinkers, leaders, artists, scientists, generals, and innovators whose achievements shaped the world in countless ways. Alexander may be the brightest star in the constellation. He's just not the only one shining there. When people talk about the achievements of ancient Greece, they usually focus on the philosophers, the poets, the scientists, and the politicians. And those achievements were remarkable. But there is an uncomfortable truth hiding behind many of them. Ancient Greek civilization relied heavily on slavery. In fact, slavery was so common that most Greeks barely questioned its existence. This can be difficult for modern audiences to understand, because we tend to associate slavery with specific periods of history. For the Greeks, however, it was woven into everyday life. Slaves worked in homes, workshops, farms, mines, construction projects, and businesses throughout the Greek world. Many wealthy households owned slaves. Some middle-class households owned slaves. Even people who were not particularly wealthy sometimes hoped to own slaves if they could afford them. The institution was deeply embedded in society. Athens, the city celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, depended heavily on enslaved labour. This creates one of the great contradictions of ancient Greece. The same society that produced passionate discussions about freedom, citizenship, justice, and political participation also denied those rights to large portions of its population. A citizen might spend the morning debating liberty in the assembly and the afternoon returning home to a household maintained by enslaved workers. History is often less tidy than we would like. The situation in Sparta was even more extreme. Spartan society depended on a large population known as helots. These were not slaves in exactly the same sense as those found elsewhere in Greece, but they lived under severe restrictions and were forced to work the land for Spartan citizens. In many areas, helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans themselves. This imbalance created constant anxiety. Much of Sparta's military culture was shaped by the fear of rebellion. Spartan leaders worried continually about maintaining control over a population that had every reason to dislike them, which, if we're being honest, was not an entirely irrational concern. Conditions varied greatly depending on location and circumstance. Some slaves worked in households and developed relatively stable relationships with their owners. Others faced brutal treatment. The silver mines at Laurion near Athens were especially notorious. Thousands of enslaved workers endured dangerous conditions underground, performing exhausting labour that helped fuel the city's economy. Few Greek philosophers openly challenged the institution. Even thinkers whose ideas influenced modern concepts of justice often accepted slavery as a normal part of society. The truth is that many of ancient Greece's greatest achievements rested upon foundations that included forced labour. This does not erase Greek accomplishments, nor does it excuse the system. Instead, It reminds us that civilizations are complicated. The Greeks gave the world extraordinary ideas about freedom and citizenship, but they did not apply those ideas equally to everyone around them. Like many societies throughout history, they saw contradictions that seem obvious to us while remaining surprisingly invisible to themselves. When modern people think about ancient Greece, they often imagine a single civilization moving through history together, united by language, culture, and a shared identity. The Greeks themselves would probably have found this idea amusing, or suspicious, or a useful excuse to start another war. The truth is that ancient Greece was almost never politically united. Instead, it consisted of hundreds of independent city-states, each fiercely protective of its own interests. Athens had its priorities. Sparta had its priorities. Corinth had its priorities. Thebes had its priorities. And quite often, those priorities involved arguing with one another. The Greeks shared a common language, similar religious traditions, and many cultural practices. They worshipped the same gods, celebrated common festivals, and competed in events like the Olympic Games. But these shared traditions did not magically create political harmony. If anything, they often provided more opportunities for rivalry. Athens and Sparta offer the most famous example. During the Persian Wars, Greek city-states managed to cooperate against the enormous Persian Empire. Together, they achieved remarkable victories that preserved Greek independence. For a brief moment, unity seemed possible. Then the Persians stopped being an immediate threat, and the Greeks returned to what they did best, competing with other Greeks. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta eventually exploded into the Peloponnesian War, one of the most destructive conflicts in Greek history. The war lasted for decades, devastated entire regions, weakened both sides, and left much of Greece exhausted. The historian Thucydides recorded the conflict in extraordinary detail, and one thing becomes clear very quickly. Nobody was having a good time. Cities switched alliances. Former allies became enemies. Political factions fought each other. Military campaigns dragged on year after year. At several points, everyone involved seemed determined to prove that cooperation had merely been a temporary administrative error. Even after Sparta eventually emerged victorious, peace remained elusive. Thebes rose to challenge Spartan dominance. Other city-states formed new alliances. Old rivalries continued. The cycle repeated itself with remarkable consistency. This constant division had serious consequences. By the 4th century BC, years of warfare had weakened many Greek states. When Philip II of Macedon began expanding his power, the Greeks struggled to present a united front. Many cities remained too busy distrusting one another. History occasionally offers painful lessons about the cost of disunity. Ancient Greece provides several. The truth is that Greek civilization was connected by culture far more than by politics. The Greeks often saw themselves as part of a broader Hellenic world, but their primary loyalty usually belonged to their own city-state. They were united just often enough to accomplish remarkable things, and divided often enough to make those accomplishments considerably more difficult, which, in fairness, is a pattern that would remain familiar throughout much of human history. By now, a pattern has probably started to emerge. The Spartans were not invincible. Democracy was limited. Philosophers were controversial. The Olympic Games were brutal. The Greeks were rarely united. And yet, despite all these myths falling away, ancient Greece remains one of the most influential civilizations in history. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest misconception of all. The idea that ancient Greece, particularly the famous Golden Age of Athens, was some kind of flawless era of wisdom, enlightenment, and intellectual perfection. It wasn't. The Golden Age produced extraordinary achievements. The Parthenon was built. Great works of literature were written. Philosophy flourished. Art, architecture, science, and politics reached impressive new heights. But everyday life remained far from ideal. Athens was filled with political rivalries, public scandals, corruption, legal disputes, and social inequalities. Politicians frequently attacked one another. Citizens argued constantly. Laws changed. Factions competed for influence. Public opinion could shift rapidly and unpredictably. In other words, it was populated by human beings. The city also faced recurring outbreaks of disease. During the Peloponnesian War, a devastating plague struck Athens, killing thousands of people. Entire families disappeared. Social order weakened. Fear spread throughout the city. The greatest intellectual centre in Greece proved just as vulnerable to disease as any other ancient society. Then there was warfare. Modern discussions often focus on Greek philosophy, while quietly ignoring how much time the Greeks spent fighting. A lot. Wars between city-states were common. Military service was expected. Entire generations grew up knowing that conflict could arrive at any moment. Even Athens, famous for its cultural achievements, devoted enormous resources to military power. The reality is that Greek civilization balanced brilliance and violence side by side. The same society that produced Plato also produced political executions. The same civilization that built magnificent temples also relied on slavery. The same people who debated justice and virtue could be ruthless toward rivals. None of this makes ancient Greece less impressive. In fact, it makes it more interesting. The greatest civilizations in history are rarely perfect. They succeed not because they overcome every flaw, but because they manage to create remarkable achievements despite those flaws. Ancient Greece changed the world through its ideas, discoveries, and innovations. Its influence can still be seen in modern politics, philosophy, science, literature, and art. But the Greeks were not mythical heroes living in a golden paradise. They were ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. They made mistakes. They argued. They failed. They succeeded. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden beneath all the myths. Ancient Greece was not remarkable because it was perfect. It was remarkable because it was human. And 2,500 years later, we're still talking about it, which is probably more impressive than being undefeated at Thermopylae ever was. When people imagined Constantinople, they pictured sunlight shining from golden church domes, busy harbours packed with ships from 3 continents, and enormous walls guarding the richest city in Europe. Travellers wrote about magnificent palaces, crowded markets, and ceremonies so extravagant they could make neighbouring kings question their career choices. What few people realised was that beneath this glorious city existed another Constantinople, a hidden Constantinople, a dark labyrinth of cisterns, tunnels, chambers, passageways, forgotten foundations, and mysterious spaces buried beneath centuries of construction. While merchants haggled above ground and emperors ruled from marble halls, an entirely different world remained concealed below their feet. The underground story of Constantinople began with a simple problem: water. The city occupied a strategic peninsula, protected by the sea on 3 sides. This made it difficult to conquer, but it also created a challenge. A population that sometimes approached 500,000 people required an enormous and reliable water supply. Public baths, fountains, monasteries, workshops, and imperial palaces consumed staggering quantities every day. The solution was one of the greatest engineering projects of the ancient world. Roman and Byzantine engineers built aqueducts that carried water across valleys and hills from distant sources. The most famous of these systems stretched for hundreds of kilometres through Thrace before reaching the capital. Yet bringing water to Constantinople was only part of the challenge. The city also needed places to store it, so the Byzantines began digging. They excavated vast underground reservoirs known as cisterns. Some were modest structures hidden beneath churches or homes. Others were enormous underground lakes supported by forests of stone columns. Hundreds of cisterns eventually spread beneath the city. Many citizens walked over them every day without giving them a second thought. Under a baker's shop might be a forgotten reservoir. Beneath a nobleman's residence could lie an ancient chamber built centuries earlier by an emperor whose name most people had already forgotten. As generations passed, the underground city continued to grow. New buildings rose on top of old ones. Churches replaced temples. Palaces replaced earlier palaces. Streets shifted. Entire neighbourhoods were rebuilt. Each transformation left traces below ground, creating layers upon layers of hidden history. Over time, many of these spaces disappeared from memory. Maps were lost. Entrances were sealed. Earthquakes damaged passages. Some chambers flooded. Others simply faded from public knowledge. By the Middle Ages, even many residents of Constantinople no longer knew what existed beneath them. The city had developed a second life underground, a silent world of darkness and echoes waiting to be rediscovered centuries later, and this was only the beginning of the mystery. Among all the underground wonders hidden beneath Constantinople, none captured the imagination quite like the massive cistern known today as the Basilica Cistern. To modern visitors, it feels less like a reservoir and more like the ruins of a forgotten underground kingdom. Imagine descending a staircase beneath a crowded city street. The noise of merchants, carts and conversations slowly fades behind you. The air becomes cooler. The light grows dim. Then suddenly, a vast chamber opens before your eyes. Rows upon rows of towering columns disappear into the darkness. Reflections shimmer across still water. Shadows dance across ancient stone. Every footstep echoes through the enormous space. For a moment, it is easy to forget that this place was built for something as practical as storing water. The cistern was constructed during the reign of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. This was the same ambitious ruler responsible for rebuilding much of Constantinople after devastating riots nearly destroyed the city. Justinian had grand plans, and apparently one of them was ensuring that nobody in the capital would become thirsty during a siege. The scale was astonishing. The reservoir measured roughly the length of several football fields and could store tens of thousands of cubic meters of water. Hundreds of marble columns supported its roof, creating what looked like an endless stone forest underground. But the columns themselves raised questions. Many had clearly not been carved specifically for the cistern. Byzantine builders frequently reused materials from older Roman structures. Temples, public buildings, and monuments that had fallen into ruin were dismantled and their components transported elsewhere. As a result, the columns inside the cistern often differ from one another. Some have elegant Corinthian capitals. Others display different artistic styles. It is as though dozens of ancient buildings were quietly gathered together underground and given a second life. Then there were the famous Medusa heads. Deep within the cistern, two enormous carved stone heads serve as column bases. One lies on its side, the other rests upside down. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps the builders simply used whatever stones were available. Perhaps it was a symbolic way of stripping old pagan images of their power. Or perhaps some exhausted engineer simply looked at a giant Medusa head and thought, That will do. That. Historians continue to debate the answer. What makes the mystery even more fascinating is that the cistern eventually disappeared from public memory. For centuries, many people living above it had no idea it existed. Yet the hidden reservoir remained below their feet, patiently waiting in the darkness, preserving one of Constantinople's greatest secrets. If the great cisterns of Constantinople were real, documented and visible, the tunnels were something far more mysterious. For centuries, stories circulated about secret passages running beneath the city. According to rumours, some connected imperial palaces to churches. Others supposedly linked monasteries, military installations, and hidden escape routes stretching for miles underground. The problem for historians is that Constantinople produced almost as many underground legends as underground structures. Separating fact from fiction can feel like searching for a single coin in the Grand Bazaar while blindfolded, yet some of the stories refuse to disappear. The emperors of Byzantium certainly had good reasons to build secret routes. Constantinople was a city filled with political intrigue. Assassinations, coups, palace conspiracies and civil wars appeared with surprising regularity. A ruler might attend a grand ceremony in the morning and discover by afternoon that 3 generals, 2 cousins, and half the Senate suddenly preferred someone else on the throne. In such an environment, escape routes were not luxuries. They were career investments. Several historical sources mention hidden passages associated with the Great Palace, the enormous imperial complex overlooking the Sea of Marmara. The palace itself was so vast that it resembled a small city. Within its walls stood halls, courtyards, chapels, gardens, libraries, barracks, and residences. It would hardly be surprising if secret corridors existed somewhere within this maze. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered underground passageways connected to parts of the palace complex. Some likely served practical purposes, allowing servants, guards, and officials to move unseen between important locations. Others remain more difficult to explain. Beneath parts of the city, explorers have found blocked tunnels disappearing into darkness. Some end abruptly. Others continue beyond areas that have yet to be fully investigated. Earthquakes, collapses, and centuries of construction have altered the underground landscape so dramatically that many original routes may never be completely understood. Naturally, the uncertainty encouraged wild speculation. One legend claimed that tunnels connected the Hagia Sophia to distant parts of the city. Another suggested hidden chambers filled with imperial treasures still remained undiscovered. Some stories even described monks carrying sacred relics through secret passages during times of invasion. Evidence for such tales is often thin, but that has never stopped people from believing them. After all, when a city possesses thousands of years of history layered beneath its streets, every sealed doorway becomes a potential mystery. Every unexplored corridor invites imagination. And nowhere in Constantinople was imagination more active than beneath the imperial heart of the city, where some believed entire forgotten worlds still waited in the darkness. The deeper historians investigate Constantinople's underground world, the more they encounter a frustrating reality. Entire sections are missing. Not missing in the sense that they were destroyed completely. Missing in the sense that nobody knows exactly where they are, how extensive they once were, or what secrets they may have contained. Nowhere is this mystery greater than beneath the ruins of the Great Palace of Constantinople. For nearly 800 years, the Great Palace served as the centre of Byzantine power. Emperors ruled from its halls. Foreign ambassadors walked its corridors. Generals celebrated victories there. Court officials spent entire careers navigating its complicated politics while trying not to accidentally offend someone important enough to have them exiled. The palace was enormous. It stretched across a large section of the city overlooking the Sea of Marmara. Visitors described magnificent reception halls, private chapels, gardens, terraces, and rooms decorated with gold, marble, and mosaics. Some compared it to a city within a city, yet today, much of it has vanished. Centuries of rebuilding, earthquakes, fires, and Ottoman construction gradually buried large portions of the complex beneath newer structures. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments, but the overwhelming majority remains hidden beneath modern Istanbul. And beneath those buried ruins lie even more mysteries. Excavations have revealed underground chambers, vaulted rooms, storage areas, and passageways associated with the palace. Some appear to have been used for supplies. Others likely housed servants or guards. A few seem designed for purposes that remain uncertain. The challenge is that archaeologists cannot simply dig up an entire modern city to find answers. Beneath apartment buildings, roads, shops, and houses may lie chambers untouched for centuries. Historians know they exist because fragments occasionally appear during construction projects. Workers digging foundations have sometimes uncovered forgotten walls, tunnels, staircases, and underground rooms that nobody realized were there. Each discovery raises new questions. What else remains hidden nearby? How many palace structures still survive underground? Could entire sections of the imperial complex remain sealed beneath the modern city? Some researchers believe this is entirely possible. Constantinople was continuously inhabited for more than 16 centuries. Every generation built on top of the previous one. Layers accumulated. Streets rose higher. Buildings covered older buildings. The result resembles a historical layer cake, except this particular cake occasionally contains Byzantine tunnels, Roman foundations, and enough mysteries to keep archaeologists awake at night. Somewhere beneath modern Istanbul, portions of the imperial world may still rest undisturbed, silent, dark, and waiting for the next accidental discovery to bring them back into the light. Few places in Constantinople inspired more awe than the city's monasteries. These were not simply quiet buildings where monks copied manuscripts and prayed all day. Many were wealthy institutions with libraries, workshops, storerooms, gardens, and extensive underground spaces. Some had existed for centuries, accumulating layers of additions and modifications that transformed them into sprawling complexes. And beneath several of these monasteries lay worlds rarely seen by ordinary citizens. Underground chambers served many purposes. Some functioned as storage areas for food, wine, oil, and valuable documents. Others provided cool, stable conditions for preserving supplies throughout the year. A few were designed as crypts, where important religious figures were buried. Yet over time, these underground spaces became the source of countless stories. One reason was simple. Monks often went where ordinary people did not. A citizen might visit a monastery chapel, donate a few coins, light a candle, and leave. He would never see the staircases descending beneath the building. He would never enter the vaults or hidden chambers where monks stored relics and manuscripts. The unseen naturally encouraged speculation. Rumours spread that certain monasteries possessed secret passageways. Some claimed underground routes connected distant religious sites across the city. Others insisted that sacred treasures were hidden below ground, protected from thieves and invaders. When danger approached Constantinople, such stories multiplied. The city endured countless wars, sieges, and periods of unrest. During these crises, monks were known to hide valuable religious objects. Relics associated with saints, precious manuscripts, and ceremonial items sometimes vanished from public view. People wondered where they went. The obvious answer was underground. As generations passed, stories became more elaborate. Some claimed entire collections of sacred artifacts remained hidden beneath forgotten monasteries. Others described sealed chambers filled with ancient manuscripts that had never been rediscovered. There is little evidence for most of these tales, but history occasionally rewards the dreamers. Archaeologists working in former monastery sites have uncovered unexpected crypts, hidden rooms, and underground structures that had been forgotten for centuries. These discoveries remind historians that even the most cautious legends sometimes contain a grain of truth. The monks themselves added to the mystery. Many Byzantine monks sought solitude and contemplation. Underground chapels offered silence unavailable in the bustling city above. There, surrounded by stone walls and flickering lamps, they could pray far from the noise of Constantinople. To outsiders, such behaviour seemed strange. To the monks, it was devotion. But centuries later, when entrances were sealed and memories faded, those silent underground spaces became yet another piece of Constantinople's buried puzzle, hidden beneath the streets, waiting to be found again. If any building in Constantinople seemed destined to gather mysteries, it was Hagia Sophia. For nearly 1,000 years, it stood as the greatest church in the Christian world. Emperors were crowned beneath its vast dome. Patriarchs delivered sermons within its walls. Travellers arriving from distant lands often struggled to describe its scale, settling instead for phrases that amounted to, "You really had to see it yourself." Above ground, Hagia Sophia was magnificent. Below ground, it was mysterious. For centuries, stories circulated about hidden chambers, flooded tunnels, and secret passageways beneath the great church. Some tales were grounded in reality, others drifted into the realm of legend. Together, they created one of Constantinople's most enduring underground mysteries. Part of the fascination came from necessity. A structure as enormous as Hagia Sophia required a complex foundation system. Byzantine engineers had to stabilize the building on difficult terrain while protecting it from earthquakes that regularly shook the region. Beneath the church, they constructed vaults, support structures, and underground spaces that helped distribute its tremendous weight. Over time, many of these areas disappeared from public view. Some became inaccessible, others flooded. A few were simply forgotten. As centuries passed, curiosity grew. People began asking what exactly existed beneath the famous church. Explorations conducted in modern times have revealed a network of underground chambers and passageways below Hagia Sophia. Some contain water, others appear connected to ancient drainage systems. A few extend farther than researchers initially expected. Not surprisingly, these discoveries inspired even more speculation. One popular legend claimed that secret tunnels linked Hagia Sophia to the Great Palace. Another suggested that clergy could move unseen through hidden passages during times of crisis. Some stories described underground escape routes used when enemies threatened the city. Evidence for these claims remains uncertain. Yet the church's dramatic history encouraged such theories. Hagia Sophia survived riots, invasions, earthquakes, religious disputes, and the fall of an empire. It witnessed events that reshaped entire civilizations. If any building seemed likely to conceal hidden secrets, this was the one. Then there were the stories surrounding the final days of Constantinople. According to later legends, priests conducting services inside Hagia Sophia disappeared into hidden passages as Ottoman forces entered the city in 1453. Some versions claimed they would emerge again only when the city returned to Christian rule. Historians treat such stories as folklore rather than fact, but folklore often survives because it captures something deeper. In this case, it reflected the belief that beneath Hagia Sophia, beneath its stone floors and towering columns, history itself remained hidden, waiting in darkness long after emperors' armies and entire empires had passed away. The Basilica Cistern may be the most famous underground structure in Constantinople, but it was only one piece of a much larger hidden network. In reality, the city contained hundreds of cisterns. Some were massive engineering projects built by emperors. Others were modest reservoirs serving neighbourhoods, monasteries, palaces, or individual buildings. Together, they formed a vast underground water system unlike anything else in medieval Europe. The remarkable part is that many of them were eventually forgotten, not destroyed. Forgotten as centuries passed, populations shifted, districts changed, and new rulers altered the city. Water systems were repaired, abandoned, replaced, and rebuilt. A cistern that had once been essential to daily life could slowly disappear from memory. The structure itself remained, only its purpose was lost. This created some unusual situations. In certain cases, houses and shops were constructed directly above ancient reservoirs. Generations lived their entire lives without realizing that enormous chambers existed beneath their feet. Some residents occasionally noticed strange sounds coming from below, or discovered unusually cool air rising through cracks in the ground. Most simply ignored it. Life in Constantinople provided enough daily concerns without investigating mysterious holes in the floor. Yet every now and then, someone stumbled upon one of these forgotten spaces. Historical accounts describe people lowering buckets into openings and discovering water far below. Others found sealed staircases leading into darkness. In some cases, residents reportedly fished through holes in basement floors without fully understanding that they were standing above ancient Byzantine reservoirs. Imagine catching dinner from a hidden underground lake and never asking why there was a lake beneath your house. History occasionally works that way. Modern archaeologists continue to discover previously unknown cisterns throughout Istanbul. Construction projects frequently reveal chambers that had vanished from historical records centuries earlier. Some are remarkably well preserved, complete with columns, vaulted ceilings, and ancient brickwork. Others appear almost frozen in time. Dust covers the floors. Water slowly drips from ceilings. Stone arches stand exactly where Byzantine engineers placed them over 1,000 years ago. The silence can be unsettling. These forgotten reservoirs remind us that Constantinople was built not only outward and upward, but downward as well. Every emperor who expanded the city added another layer. Every generation left structures that later generations might overlook. As a result, parts of Byzantine Constantinople remain hidden even today. Beneath busy streets, apartment blocks, and modern shops, forgotten cisterns continue their patient existence. Dark, silent, and still holding secrets from an empire that vanished centuries ago. Whenever people discover hidden tunnels, sealed chambers, or forgotten underground vaults, one question inevitably follows. What treasures might still be down there? For centuries, the people of Constantinople asked themselves the same thing. The city was one of the wealthiest capitals in history. Emperors accumulated vast fortunes. Churches possessed gold, silver, jewels, and priceless religious artifacts. Noble families stored wealth that could rival the treasuries of smaller kingdoms. Merchants arriving from Europe, Asia, and Africa brought valuable goods from every corner of the known world. When so much wealth exists in one place for more than 1,000 years, stories of hidden treasure become almost unavoidable. And Constantinople had plenty of stories. Some legends claim that Byzantine emperors concealed emergency reserves of gold beneath their palaces. Others spoke of sealed chambers filled with crowns, ceremonial armour, and imperial regalia hidden during times of political chaos. There were good reasons why such rumours persisted. The Byzantine Empire endured countless crises. Civil wars erupted. Rival claimants fought for the throne. Foreign armies threatened the city. During these dangerous periods, valuables were often moved, concealed, or stored in secure locations. Sometimes the people responsible for hiding them never returned. A noble might die in battle. A palace official could be executed during a political purge. A monastery might be abandoned after an invasion. Knowledge of certain hiding places could disappear surprisingly quickly. Then came the greatest upheaval of all. In 1453, Ottoman forces captured Constantinople after a long siege. The fall of the city marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. Buildings changed hands. Records vanished. Entire districts were transformed. In the confusion, countless stories emerged about treasures hidden before the final assault. According to some legends, priests concealed sacred relics beneath churches. Others claimed wealthy families buried valuables in underground chambers before fleeing. A few tales described entire caches of imperial treasure still waiting to be discovered. Most historians remained skeptical. After all, treasure legends tend to multiply faster than actual treasure. Yet archaeology occasionally produces surprises. Excavations throughout modern Istanbul have uncovered forgotten vaults, sealed rooms, buried artifacts, and unexpected collections of historical objects. While none have revealed the legendary imperial hoards imagined by storytellers, they demonstrate an important fact. The underground city still contains discoveries. Every construction project has the potential to reveal something unseen for centuries. Every newly opened chamber raises fresh questions. And somewhere beneath the streets of modern Istanbul, hidden behind walls of stone and layers of history, there may still be secrets waiting for the fortunate, or stubborn, individual who finally uncovers them. After centuries of excavations, discoveries, and exploration, historians have reached a surprising conclusion about Constantinople's underground world. They still do not know all of it. In fact, they may know only a fraction. Vlad Dracula, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler, entered a world where survival was never guaranteed. He was born around 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Sighișoara, a fortified settlement perched among the rolling hills of what is now Romania. At the time, nobody could have guessed that this dark-haired noble child would one day inspire legends, terrify armies, and become one of the most infamous rulers in European history. For now, however, he was simply Vlad, the second son of a nobleman with dangerous ambitions. His father, Vlad Dracul, belonged to the warrior aristocracy of Wallachia, a small principality caught between powerful rivals. To the north stood the Kingdom of Hungary. To the south stretched the expanding Ottoman Empire. Both powers wanted influence over Wallachia. Both expected loyalty. Both had armies large enough to make disagreement a very unhealthy hobby. Young Vlad grew up in the shadow of this reality. Wallachia occupied one of the most contested frontiers in Europe. Every ruler faced impossible choices: support Hungary and risk Ottoman invasion, support the Ottomans and risk Hungarian retaliation, try pleasing both sides and discover that neither appreciated the effort. Politics in the region resembled a game of chess played by people who occasionally flipped the board and stabbed each other. While Vlad spent his earliest years in Sighișoara, his father worked tirelessly to strengthen the family's position. He travelled between courts, negotiated alliances, and sought powerful friends. These efforts eventually earned him membership in the prestigious Order of the Dragon, a chivalric organization dedicated to defending Christianity against Ottoman expansion. It was from this honor that the family gained its famous name. Tranguil referred to the dragon emblem worn by members of the order. Vlad would later become known as Dracula, meaning son of Tranguil or son of the dragon. At the time, however, titles mattered less to a child than daily life. Vlad likely spent his early years learning the skills expected of a young noble. He would have received instruction in religion, court etiquette, reading, writing, and the use of weapons. Hunting, horseback riding, and military exercises were considered essential parts of aristocratic education. Yet even during childhood, danger was never far away. The fortunes of noble families could change overnight. Alliances shifted constantly. Rebellions erupted with alarming frequency. Princes were overthrown, imprisoned, exiled, or killed with enough regularity to make long-term planning seem optimistic. For young Vlad, childhood was not a peaceful beginning. It was preparation for a storm that was already gathering on the horizon. As Vlad grew older, he became increasingly aware that his family was not like most others. His father was no ordinary nobleman. Vlad Dracul was a prince, a warrior, and a man who spent much of his life navigating the dangerous politics of Eastern Europe. One day he might be negotiating with Hungarian kings. The next, he could be exchanging messages with Ottoman officials. In Wallachia, flexibility was often the difference between ruling and becoming a cautionary tale. Around the time Vlad was born, his father received one of the highest honours available to a Christian noble. He was inducted into the Order of the Dragon. Founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, the Order was an elite brotherhood dedicated to defending Christianity and resisting Ottoman expansion. Its members wore a distinctive dragon emblem, a symbol that quickly became associated with Vlad's father. The title Dracul emerged from this connection. Today, people often associate the word with devils and vampires, but in Vlad's time it was closely linked to the dragon symbol of the Order. For the family, it represented prestige, military duty, and political importance. Young Vlad grew up surrounded by these symbols. He likely saw banners displaying dragons. He heard stories about battles against the Ottomans. He watched armed retainers come and go from his father's court. Discussions of war, diplomacy, and survival were probably as common as conversations about weather. This was not the sort of childhood where adults carefully shielded children from harsh realities. The frontier world of Wallachia offered no such luxury. From an early age, Vlad would have understood that rulers survived through strength. Weakness invited challenges. Hesitation encouraged rivals. Mercy was admired in theory, but often dangerous in practice. His education reflected these realities. Alongside religious instruction and literacy, noble boys learned horsemanship, hunting, swordsmanship, and military discipline. Hunting expeditions served as training grounds for future warriors. A successful hunt taught patience, courage, and the ability to act decisively, lessons that would prove useful later. Meanwhile, the political situation around Wallachia grew increasingly unstable. The Ottoman Empire continued expanding into the Balkans. Hungarian leaders searched for ways to contain the threat. Local nobles shifted loyalties whenever it suited their interests. Caught between these competing forces, Vlad's father constantly faced difficult decisions. Every alliance created enemies, every compromise carried risks, and every year the pressure increased. For young Vlad, these tensions formed the backdrop of daily life. He was growing up in a household that sat at the centre of a geopolitical struggle. The dragon emblem worn by his father symbolised honour and power, but it also painted a target on the family's back. Soon, events beyond Vlad's control would force him to leave the relative safety of home and enter a world far more dangerous than anything he had known before. As Vlad entered his early teenage years, the world around him became even more unstable. Wallachia remained trapped between powerful neighbours, but now the pressure was increasing. The Ottoman Empire was expanding steadily through the Balkans, swallowing territories that had once seemed secure. To the north, Hungary remained determined to resist Ottoman influence. Between these giants stood Wallachia, a small principality trying very hard not to be crushed. For Prince Vlad Dracul, ruling such a land was a constant balancing act. One year he might support Hungarian interests. The next, he might cooperate with the Ottomans. To modern observers, this can seem contradictory, but survival often required flexibility. A ruler who stubbornly chose one side could quickly find himself invaded by the other. Young Vlad watched all of this unfold. His father's court was filled with messengers, soldiers, diplomats, and noblemen seeking favour. Decisions made in distant capitals could suddenly change life in Wallachia. News of battles, treaties, betrayals, and political intrigues arrived regularly. It was an education unlike any classroom could provide. Yet the greatest threat often came from within. The princes of Wallachia did not rule with absolute security. Powerful noble families, known as boyars, constantly competed for influence. Some supported the ruling prince, others secretly backed rivals. A few seemed willing to support almost anyone as long as it benefited themselves. This created a dangerous environment. A prince could defeat foreign enemies and still lose his throne because of domestic conspiracies. Assassinations, coups, and betrayals were common features of political life. Loyalty was valuable, but it was also rare. Vlad was learning this lesson firsthand. As the son of the ruling prince, he occupied a privileged position, but he was also a target. If his father lost power, the consequences for the entire family could be severe. In medieval politics, defeated rulers rarely received retirement cottages and warm farewell ceremonies. The safest rival was often considered a dead rival. Such realities likely accelerated Vlad's maturity. While many noble boys elsewhere focused primarily on tournaments and hunting, Vlad was growing up in a court where political survival was discussed almost daily. He learned to observe people carefully. Who could be trusted? Who was pretending? Who might change sides tomorrow? These questions mattered. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II continued strengthening his empire. His armies grew larger. His influence expanded closer to Wallachia's borders. Eventually, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Vlad Dracul would soon be forced to make a difficult decision to secure his position. That decision would change his son's life forever. For before long, young Vlad would leave Wallachia and enter the court of the Ottoman Sultan, not as a guest, but as a hostage. In 1442, Vlad's childhood came to an abrupt end. His father, Vlad Dracul, found himself caught in an increasingly dangerous political situation. The Ottoman Empire expected loyalty. Hungary expected resistance. Trying to satisfy both sides had become almost impossible. The ruler of Wallachia needed to prove to Sultan Murad II that he could be trusted. The price of that trust was his own sons. To guarantee Vlad Dracul's loyalty, the Ottomans demanded hostages. Such arrangements were common in the medieval world. Powerful rulers often took the children of allied princes and nobles into their custody. Officially, these young hostages were treated as honoured guests. Unofficially, everyone understood the situation. If their fathers rebelled, the consequences could be severe. And so Vlad, likely around 11 years old, and his younger brother Radu were sent south into Ottoman territory. Imagine the journey from the perspective of a young prince. One day, you are living at your father's court, surrounded by familiar faces and landscapes. The next, you are travelling hundreds of miles away from home toward the capital of a foreign empire. Every mile carries you farther from everything you know. For Vlad, the experience must have been unsettling. The Ottoman Empire was unlike anything he had previously encountered. It was larger, wealthier, and far more powerful than Wallachia. Its armies conquered kingdoms. Its rulers commanded territories stretching across continents. To a young boy from a frontier principality, the scale alone would have been overwhelming. Yet the Ottomans did not throw their hostages into dungeons. That popular image belongs more to fiction than reality. Young, noble hostages were often educated alongside other elite youths. They received instruction, training, and opportunities to observe the workings of the empire. The goal was partly practical. Future rulers who understood Ottoman culture and respected Ottoman power were more likely to remain cooperative. Vlad soon found himself living within this carefully controlled environment. He learned Turkish customs. He observed Ottoman administration. He witnessed the discipline that made the empire such a formidable force. At the same time, however, he never forgot the truth. He was not free. His future depended entirely upon decisions made by other men. Every letter from Wallachia mattered. Every political development could affect his fate. If his father remained loyal, life continued. If his father rebelled, everything could change overnight. For a young prince accustomed to privilege, this loss of control was a harsh lesson. And while Vlad adapted to life in the Ottoman world, resentment slowly began to grow. A resentment that would shape much of his future. Because while Radu would eventually embrace life among the Ottomans, Vlad never truly stopped thinking about home. As the months turned into years, Vlad settled into a life he had never expected. He remained a hostage of the Ottoman Empire, but his days were far from idle. The Ottoman court was determined to transform young noble hostages into educated, disciplined, and useful future rulers. If Vlad was going to spend his youth in captivity, he would at least receive one of the finest educations available in the 15th century. The young prince quickly discovered that the Ottoman world valued discipline above almost everything else. Schedules were strict, training was demanding, expectations were high. This was not a place where a prince could spend his mornings sleeping late, and his afternoons inventing excuses to avoid work. The Ottoman Empire was expanding because it was organized, efficient, and ruthless when necessary. Its leaders expected the same qualities from the young men under their supervision. Vlad studied languages, administration, military tactics, and diplomacy. He learned how one of the world's most powerful empires governed its territories. He observed officials who managed provinces larger than his entire homeland. For a future ruler, the lessons were invaluable. He also witnessed the military machine that terrified much of Europe. The Ottoman army was disciplined in a way that impressed even its enemies. Soldiers trained constantly. Officers expected obedience. Campaigns were planned with remarkable efficiency. To young Vlad, it must have become increasingly clear why so many kingdoms struggled to stop Ottoman expansion. Strength was not accidental. It was carefully built. Yet despite the opportunities available to him, Vlad never fully embraced his new surroundings. The court was magnificent, the education was excellent. But none of it changed the fact that he was there against his will. Every lesson served as a reminder that his freedom depended on forces beyond his control. His younger brother Radu reacted differently. Radu adapted quickly to Ottoman life. He learned the language, made friends, and became comfortable within the court's culture. Ottoman officials admired him. Over time, he developed strong connections with influential figures. Vlad watched this happen with mixed feelings. The brothers had entered captivity together, but they were beginning to walk very different paths. Where Radu found acceptance, Vlad found frustration. Where Radu saw opportunity, Vlad saw imprisonment. The contrast would only deepen as they grew older. Meanwhile, news from Wallachia continued to arrive from time to time. Political alliances shifted. Rival factions competed for power. The future of their family remained uncertain. Vlad could do little except wait and watch. But waiting can be dangerous for an ambitious young man. Years spent observing the Ottoman Empire gave Vlad valuable knowledge, but they also gave him something else. Time to think. Time to remember. And time to develop the determination that would eventually make him one of the most feared rulers in Europe. The longer Vlad and Radu remained at the Ottoman court, the more obvious it became that captivity was shaping them in very different ways. When they first arrived, both brothers had been frightened young princes far from home. They shared the same memories, the same family, and the same uncertain future. But years of life inside the Ottoman Empire slowly pulled them in opposite directions. Radu adapted remarkably well. He learned Turkish fluently. He embraced the customs of the court. He earned the respect of his instructors and developed friendships with powerful figures. By all accounts, he was intelligent, charming, and comfortable navigating the sophisticated world of the Ottoman elite. The Ottomans admired him. In many ways, he became exactly the kind of hostage they hoped to create. Someone who understood their culture, someone who respected their power, someone who might one day rule Wallachia while remaining friendly to Ottoman interests. Vlad, however, followed a different path. He learned the same lessons and received the same education, but his attitude was entirely different. He absorbed knowledge eagerly, yet he never truly accepted his situation. Beneath his disciplined exterior, resentment continued to grow. Every military exercise reminded him that he was not free. Every lesson in diplomacy reminded him that his future was being shaped by foreign rulers. Every passing year took him farther from the homeland he barely remembered. Unlike Radu, Vlad never seemed willing to forget that he was a hostage. This difference became increasingly noticeable. While Radu built relationships within the Ottoman world, Vlad often remained distant. He observed carefully, he learned constantly, but he kept a part of himself separate from the environment around him. Some historians believe these years played a crucial role in forming Vlad's personality. He witnessed an empire built upon discipline, authority, and fear. He saw how powerful rulers maintained control through strength and certainty. He learned that hesitation could be dangerous, and that weakness often invited disaster. These lessons stayed with him. At the same time, the political situation in Wallachia remained unstable. His father continued navigating a dangerous landscape filled with rival nobles, Hungarian interests, and Ottoman demands. Then, everything changed. News arrived from home that would shatter whatever remained of Vlad's childhood. His father, Vlad Dracul, had been overthrown. Worse still, his older brother Mircea had been captured by political enemies. The details were horrifying. Mircea was reportedly blinded and buried alive. His father was murdered. For Vlad, the loss was devastating. Years of frustration, anger, and resentment suddenly gained a focus. The boy who had entered Ottoman captivity as a prince was now becoming something else entirely. A young man with a score to settle and a throne to reclaim. The news arrived like a thunderbolt. For years, Vlad had endured life as an Ottoman hostage with the belief that one day he would return home. His father still ruled Wallachia. His family still held power. The future remained uncertain, but there was still a future to return to. Then, in 1447, everything collapsed. His father, Vlad Dracul, was dead. His older brother, Mircea, was dead as well. The dynasty that Vlad expected to inherit had been shattered. The political chaos that followed was typical of Wallachia, though that hardly made it less brutal. A faction of powerful boyars, working alongside Hungarian interests, had turned against Vlad Dracul. The prince was captured and murdered near a swamp outside Bucharest. Mircea suffered an even worse fate. According to later accounts, he was blinded and buried alive by his enemies. Whether every detail of the story is accurate remains debated by historians. What is beyond dispute is that Mircea died violently and that Vlad lost both his father and brother within the same political catastrophe. For a young man already living in captivity, the effect must have been devastating. One day, he was a hostage prince, waiting for his chance to return home. The next, he was a prince without a throne, without a father, and without an obvious future. The Ottomans watched carefully. To them, the situation presented an opportunity. Wallachia still mattered. It sat on the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary. Whoever controlled the principality could influence events throughout the region. If a ruler friendly to Ottoman interests sat on the throne, all the better. And who better than a prince who had spent years living under Ottoman supervision? Vlad suddenly became politically valuable. For the first time since arriving as a hostage, his future seemed to matter not just to himself, but to the empire around him. Yet grief and opportunity are rarely comfortable companions. The deaths of his father and brother left deep scars. Whatever frustrations Vlad had previously felt toward his enemies were now amplified by personal loss. The violence of Wallachian politics was no longer an abstract lesson. It had become his own story. Many historians believe these events marked a turning point in his life. The young prince who had once learned court etiquette and military drills was beginning to think like a claimant, a survivor, a man who would eventually need to fight for everything that had been taken from him. And the chance would come sooner than expected. Because while Wallachia's nobles fought among themselves, the Ottomans were preparing to send Vlad back. Not as a child, not as a hostage, but as a prince with a claim to the throne. By 1448, Vlad had spent years living under Ottoman supervision. He was no longer the frightened boy who had crossed the Danube as a hostage. He was now a young man educated at one of the most powerful courts in the world, familiar with military strategy, politics, and the realities of power. More importantly, he was also one of the few surviving members of his family with a legitimate claim to the throne of Wallachia. The Ottomans intended to use that claim. Wallachia had descended into political turmoil after the death of Vlad's father. Rival nobles fought for influence while competing factions struggled to control the principality. For Sultan Murad II, this instability presented an opportunity. A friendly ruler in Wallachia would strengthen Ottoman influence along a critical frontier. And Vlad seemed like the perfect candidate. With Ottoman support behind him, the young prince was sent north to claim the throne that had belonged to his father. It was a remarkable moment. Only a few years earlier, he had been a political hostage with little control over his own future. Now, he was returning to his homeland as a contender for power. But reclaiming Wallachia would not be easy. The country he returned to was deeply divided. Noble families were constantly shifting alliances. Political loyalties changed with alarming speed. Many boyars cared less about legitimacy than about which candidate offered the greatest advantage. For a young ruler, it was an extraordinarily difficult environment. Vlad did briefly succeed in gaining the throne. However, his first reign lasted only a matter of weeks. His enemies moved quickly. Hungarian-backed rivals challenged his position. The political support that had placed him on the throne proved fragile. Before long, Vlad lost control and was forced to flee. For many people, such a defeat might have ended the story. For Vlad, it became another lesson. He learned that possessing a claim was not enough. Power had to be secured, protected, defended. The experience also taught him something about the men who governed Wallachia. Many of the nobles who had betrayed his father remained influential. The same political culture that had led to his family's destruction still existed. Vlad would not forget that. Although he had failed to hold the throne, he was no longer merely reacting to events. He was actively pursuing his destiny. The years ahead would be filled with exile, shifting alliances and military struggles, but each setback only strengthened his determination. The boy who had left Wallachia as a hostage had returned as a claimant. Soon he would return again, and the next time he seized power, the rulers, nobles, and enemies of Wallachia would discover that Vlad had learned many lessons during his troubled childhood. Some of those lessons would terrify an entire region. When people think of Vlad Dracula today, they usually picture the ruler he eventually became. The decision to become a Teutonic Knight was not one that could be made lightly. Joining the order meant giving up almost everything that defined a nobleman's life. Wealth, family ambitions, marriage, personal freedom, and the possibility of a quiet future would all be sacrificed. In return, a man received a white cloak marked with a black cross, a place within one of medieval Europe's most powerful military orders, and the constant possibility of dying far from home. Oddly enough, many young nobles considered this an excellent trade. To understand why, we first need to understand the world they lived in. The Middle Ages were deeply religious. Most people genuinely believed that heaven, hell, angels, demons, and divine judgment were as real as the forests and rivers around them. Salvation was not an abstract concept. It was the central concern of life. At the same time, noblemen were trained from childhood to fight. A young aristocrat learned horsemanship before adulthood. He practiced with sword, lance, and shield. He hunted, competed in tournaments, and prepared for war. Society expected him to be a warrior. This created an interesting problem. Christian teachings praised humility, charity, and peace. Noble society expected violence, military service, and battlefield glory. The military orders offered a solution. Organizations like the Teutonic Order allowed men to combine both callings. A knight could serve God while carrying a sword. He could fight enemies of the faith while believing his actions were part of a sacred mission. It was warrior life with a religious job description. The Teutonic Order itself had begun during the Crusades in the Holy Land. Over time, it evolved into a powerful military and religious institution. By the 13th century, its influence stretched across parts of Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. Stories about the order spread widely. Young nobles heard tales of fortified castles rising from wilderness frontiers. They heard of campaigns against pagan tribes, long rides through forests, and brothers who dedicated their lives to God and war. Some were inspired by faith. Others sought adventure. A few undoubtedly liked the idea of wearing impressive armour while enjoying considerable prestige. Human motivations have always been wonderfully complicated. Yet desire alone was not enough. A man wishing to join the order faced careful scrutiny. The Teutonic Knights preferred candidates of noble birth, good reputation, and sound health. Prospective brothers needed to demonstrate commitment, discipline, and genuine willingness to accept the order's demanding lifestyle. Many dreamed of joining. Far fewer truly understood what it required. Because once the white cloak settled on your shoulders, your old life was over, and the real test was only beginning. For a young nobleman, deciding to join the Teutonic Order was only the first step. The harder part was letting go of everything he had previously expected from life. Most noble families had plans for their sons. Some were expected to inherit land. Others would strengthen family alliances through marriage. Many hoped to increase their family's influence through military service or political connections. A noble son represented an investment, and medieval parents were rarely shy about having expectations. Joining the Teutonic Order changed all of that. A man entering the order was not simply taking a new job, he was abandoning an entire future. Marriage was no longer an option. Children would never carry on his name. Family estates would pass to someone else. The comfortable image of growing old in a manor house, surrounded by descendants, disappeared completely. For many recruits, this sacrifice was enormous. Imagine being the second or third son of a wealthy family. You have spent years training as a knight. You enjoy hunting, feasting, tournaments, and the attention that comes with noble status. Then one day you decide to exchange all of that for a life governed by strict religious rules and military discipline. The transition was not always easy. Before entering the order, candidates often had practical matters to resolve. Debts needed settling. Family responsibilities required discussion. Property claims had to be clarified. The order wanted brothers who could focus entirely on their duties, not men distracted by unfinished business back home. Then came the emotional challenge: saying goodbye. Many recruits left their families knowing they might never return. The Teutonic Order operated across vast distances. Castles stood along dangerous frontiers in Prussia, Livonia, and other regions where warfare was common. Travel itself could take weeks or months. A farewell might truly be final. Parents understood this. Brothers understood this. Even the recruits themselves understood it, although young men have always possessed a remarkable ability to assume misfortune only happens to other people. As the departure date approached, reality became harder to ignore. The candidate would leave familiar landscapes behind. He would exchange the comforts of home for dormitories shared with fellow brothers. Personal ambitions would give way to the needs of the order. Individual freedom would be replaced by obedience. Not everyone could accept these sacrifices. Some changed their minds before taking vows. Others discovered that admiration for the Teutonic Knights was much easier than becoming one. Those who remained, however, stepped forward willingly. They believed they were answering a higher calling. Yet before they could wear the famous white cloak, they faced one final requirement. They had to swear vows that would govern every day for the rest of their lives. Once a candidate had left his old life behind, there was no turning back without embarrassment, disappointment, and probably a very uncomfortable conversation with everyone who had supported his decision. Now came the moment that truly separated an ordinary nobleman from a Teutonic knight: the vows. These promises were not temporary commitments or guidelines to follow when convenient. They were lifelong obligations that would shape every aspect of a brother's existence. From this point forward, the order came first. Always. The three fundamental vows were poverty, chastity, and obedience. At first glance, they sounded simple enough. In reality, they were extraordinarily demanding. The vow of poverty meant that a brother knight could own no personal wealth. This did not mean the Teutonic Order itself was poor. Far from it. The order controlled castles, lands, villages, forests, and trading privileges across large parts of Europe. The organization could be wealthy, the individual brother could not. A knight entering the order surrendered personal ownership. The horse he rode, the armour he wore, the bed he slept in, and even many of the items he used daily belonged to the order rather than to him. The vow of chastity was equally serious. Marriage was forbidden. Romantic relationships were forbidden. The brotherhood expected complete dedication to religious and military service. While many medieval nobles measured success through marriage alliances and heirs, a Teutonic knight was expected to leave such ambitions behind forever. For some men, this was perhaps the most difficult vow of all. The vow of obedience completed the transformation. Once accepted, a brother was required to obey his superiors. Orders were not treated as suggestions. The Teutonic Order functioned as a military organization, and discipline was essential to its survival. If a commander ordered a brother to travel across Europe, he went. If a commander assigned him to a remote frontier castle, he accepted. If a campaign was called, he prepared for war. Personal preference mattered very little. The needs of the order mattered greatly. During the ceremony, these vows were spoken before senior members of the Brotherhood. The candidate publicly committed himself to a life of service, discipline, and sacrifice. It was a solemn moment, one that many viewed as a second birth. The nobleman who entered the ceremony emerged as something different, a warrior monk bound by faith, duty, and obedience. Yet speaking the vows was easier than living them. The real challenge began afterward, because every day inside the Teutonic Order tested a man's commitment. Every meal, every prayer, every command, and every campaign reminded him of the promises he had made. And soon, the new brother would discover exactly how strict life inside the order could be. After taking his vows, a new Teutonic knight quickly discovered that the order was not simply a military organization. It was a way of life. Every hour of the day was regulated by rules, expectations, and routines that had been refined over generations. The order believed that discipline created strong warriors and faithful servants of God. Left to their own devices, people often developed bad habits. Medieval commanders had observed this repeatedly and apparently reached the conclusion that supervision was the safest solution. A newly admitted brother would soon find that very little happened by accident. The day began early. Before sunrise, brothers attended religious services and prayers. Spiritual duties came first. No matter how skilled a knight was with a sword, he remained a member of a religious order before he was a soldier. This distinction was important. The Teutonic knights did not see themselves as warriors who happened to pray. They saw themselves as religious brothers who happened to fight wars. After prayers came the practical responsibilities of the day. Some brothers managed supplies, others handled administration. Certain members oversaw farms, workshops, or nearby villages. Running the order required far more than charging heroically across battlefields. Someone had to count grain. History tends to celebrate the knight with the lance. It rarely remembers the brother responsible for inventory records, despite the fact that armies become considerably less effective when nobody knows where the food is. Meals were simple compared to the lavish feasts many noblemen had enjoyed before joining. Brothers ate together in communal halls. Conversation was often limited. During some meals, religious texts were read aloud while everyone listened. The atmosphere emphasized humility rather than entertainment. The same principle applied to clothing. Every knight wore the familiar white mantle marked with the black cross. Personal displays of wealth were discouraged. The order wanted uniformity. A brother's status came from his service and obedience, not from expensive jewellery or fashionable accessories. This was probably disappointing news for medieval nobles who enjoyed showing off. Throughout the day, prayers continued at scheduled intervals. Religious observance shaped the rhythm of life. Even military training and administrative work were organised around these spiritual obligations. For new recruits, adapting could be challenging. Many had grown up with servants, personal freedom, and considerable privileges. Inside the order, they were expected to follow rules alongside everyone else. Rank existed, but discipline applied to all. Some flourished in this environment, others struggled. Yet the purpose was clear. The order was transforming independent noblemen into members of a larger brotherhood. Before they could fight together, they needed to live together, pray together, and obey together. Only then would they be ready for the military training that awaited them on the dangerous frontiers of the Baltic world. Once a new brother had adapted to the routines of the order, another phase of his transformation began. Training. A Teutonic knight was expected to be both a monk and a warrior, but becoming an effective warrior required constant practice. The battlefields of the Baltic frontier were unforgiving places. Mistakes could be fatal. Hesitation could cost lives. The order therefore invested heavily in preparing its brothers for war. For many recruits, this was familiar territory. Most noblemen arrived with years of martial experience already behind them. They had learned to ride horses, handle weapons, and participate in hunting expeditions from an early age. Some had even fought in local conflicts before joining. Yet the Teutonic Order demanded something different. Individual skill was useful. Discipline within a military force was essential. A knight who fought brilliantly on his own but ignored orders could create chaos for everyone around him. The Order wanted brothers who could function as part of a larger machine. And that machine was remarkably effective. Training focused heavily on horsemanship. Mounted combat remained the heart of medieval warfare, and the Teutonic knights were famous for their heavily armoured cavalry. A brother needed complete control over his horse in every situation. The animal was not merely transportation. It was a partner in battle. Knights also practiced extensively with swords, lances, axes, and shields. Hours were spent improving technique, endurance, and coordination. Weapons had to become extensions of the body. In combat, there would be no time to stop and think about proper form. Everything needed to become instinct. Physical conditioning mattered as well. Armour was heavy. Campaigns could last weeks or months. Long rides through forests, swamps, snow and rain tested endurance constantly. The romantic image of medieval warfare often overlooks the reality that soldiers spent much of their time exhausted, cold, wet, hungry, or all four simultaneously. Military glory frequently arrived wrapped in discomfort. The brothers also studied tactics. Commanders taught formations, battlefield communication, scouting methods, and siege warfare. Campaigns against pagan tribes in Prussia and Lithuania often required fighting in difficult terrain, where forests, rivers, and harsh weather created additional challenges. Victory depended upon preparation. The Order's enemies were experienced fighters who knew the local landscape well. Underestimating them was a dangerous mistake. By the end of this training, a recruit was no longer simply a nobleman with military skills. He was becoming part of one of medieval Europe's most feared military organisations. And soon, all that preparation would face its ultimate test. Because training fields were one thing. The battlefields of the Baltic frontier were something else entirely. After months of training, prayer and discipline, a new Teutonic knight settled into the place where much of his life would unfold. The commandery. A commandery was more than a castle. It was a military base, monastery, administrative centre, warehouse, court, and home, all rolled into one. From these fortified complexes, The Teutonic Order governed territories, organised campaigns, collected taxes, stored supplies, and projected its power across the Baltic frontier. For a newly admitted brother, this was now the centre of the world. The day followed a predictable rhythm. Bells marked the hours. Prayers structured the schedule. Meals, work duties, military exercises, and religious services all took place according to established routines. The order valued consistency because consistency created discipline, and discipline kept people alive. The castle itself was usually busy. Servants moved supplies through storerooms, blacksmiths repaired weapons and armour, clerks maintained records, messengers arrived carrying news from distant commanderies, local peasants delivered rents and taxes, visiting knights stopped on their way to campaigns. Unlike the silent castles often portrayed in films, these places were full of activity. Someone was always carrying something, fixing something, counting something, or arguing about something. Many brothers shared sleeping quarters, rather than enjoying private rooms. Personal space was limited. Privacy was rare. A knight who joined the order to enjoy solitude had made a spectacular career mistake. Life was communal. You ate with your brothers. You prayed with your brothers. You trained with your brothers. And often, you slept a few feet away from brothers who snored with enough enthusiasm to challenge the castle's structural integrity. Meals reflected the order's values. Food was generally sufficient but not extravagant. Bread, fish, meat, vegetables and ale appeared regularly. Feast days brought better meals, but daily life emphasized moderation rather than luxury. The order wanted warriors, not spoiled aristocrats. Work duties varied. Some brothers served as military commanders. Others managed finances, supervised construction projects, or oversaw nearby villages. A knight might spend the morning inspecting defences and the afternoon reviewing grain inventories. Heroic battlefield charges were exciting. Paperwork, unfortunately, was eternal. Yet despite the routines, everyone understood why they were there. The frontier remained dangerous. Beyond the castle walls lay territories where raids, skirmishes and military campaigns occurred regularly. Reports from scouts and travellers constantly reminded the brothers that conflict was never far away. The commandery provided safety, structure and purpose. But it also served as a staging ground. Sooner or later, every Teutonic knight would be called upon to leave the security of the castle and ride into the wilderness. And there, on the Baltic frontier, the true test of his vows would begin. Everything a Teutonic knight learned eventually pointed toward one destination: the battlefield. The castles, prayers, vows, and endless training sessions all served a single purpose: preparing brothers for campaigns on the Baltic frontier. For many newly admitted knights, their first expedition was both exciting and terrifying. They had spent years hearing stories about holy war. Veteran brothers spoke of victories, sieges, long marches through wilderness, and battles against pagan tribes. Young recruits often imagined glorious charges, heroic deeds, and the chance to earn honour before God and their fellow knights. Reality proved somewhat less romantic. A campaign usually began with preparation. Supplies had to be gathered, horses inspected, weapons repaired, food packed. Messengers carried orders between commanderies. Commanders studied reports from scouts and local allies. Before a single sword was drawn, an enormous amount of organisation took place. Then came the march. Baltic campaigns often led through dense forests, swamps, rivers, and remote regions far removed from the comfortable castles of the Order. Roads were poor or non-existent. Weather could change suddenly. Rain transformed paths into mud. Winter brought snow and brutal cold. The enemy, meanwhile, knew the terrain far better than the invading knights. The Teutonic Order frequently fought against pagan Lithuanian and Prussian groups during its expansion into the region. These opponents were skilled warriors who used their knowledge of forests and local geography to their advantage. A knight quickly learned that courage alone was not enough. Discipline mattered. Patience mattered. Following orders mattered. A reckless charge into unfamiliar woods could end very badly. When battles occurred, they were often chaotic and frightening. Despite their training, even experienced knights understood the risks. Horses panicked. Men became separated from their units. Commands could be difficult to hear amid the noise and confusion. This was not a tournament. Nobody awarded prizes for style. The goal was survival and victory. Campaign life also involved long periods of waiting. Days might pass without combat. Knights spent time patrolling, guarding supply lines, building fortifications, or simply enduring bad weather. History remembers battles. The participants often remembered the cold. For a newly admitted brother, these experiences were transformative. The campaign tested every vow he had taken. Obedience was essential. Discipline was necessary. Faith provided comfort when conditions became difficult. Some knights returned from their first expedition filled with pride. Others returned with a much more realistic understanding of war, but every survivor came back changed. Because once a man had ridden beyond the safety of the commandery and faced the realities of the frontier, he was no longer merely learning to be a Teutonic knight. He was becoming one. For all the challenges of warfare, the greatest test of a Teutonic knight often came during the quiet moments between battles. It is one thing to remain faithful to your vows when charging into combat. It is another thing entirely to keep them year after year. The Order demanded constant discipline, and human beings have always possessed a remarkable talent for finding ways around discipline when nobody is watching. The Teutonic Knights understood this. That was why the rules remained strict long after a brother had proven himself on campaign. The vow of poverty continued to present challenges. Officially, a knight owned nothing. In reality, the Order itself controlled vast lands, castles, forests, and sources of income. Brothers often found themselves administering valuable territories and overseeing significant resources. This created temptation. A knight might not technically own wealth, but he certainly had access to it. The Order expected absolute honesty. Not everyone lived up to that expectation. The vow of obedience could also become difficult. As young recruits matured into experienced warriors, some gained confidence in their own abilities. Successful commanders developed reputations. Veterans earned respect from their peers. Yet even the most accomplished knight remained subject to the authority of the Order. Sometimes this meant accepting assignments they disliked. Sometimes it meant obeying leaders they personally disagreed with. Pride has caused problems throughout human history, and medieval military orders were no exception. Then there was the vow of chastity. Years passed. Decades passed. The brothers lived among towns, villages, merchants, and noble courts, filled with ordinary people who were free to marry, raise families, and pursue personal happiness. A Teutonic knight had renounced those possibilities. For some, faith made the sacrifice worthwhile. For others, the struggle remained constant. The Order recognized these dangers and tried to keep its members focused on their mission. Regular prayers, communal living, and strict supervision all helped reinforce discipline. But no set of rules could completely eliminate temptation. After all, the brothers were not saints. They were human beings wearing armour. The greatest challenge of all was maintaining balance. A Teutonic knight was expected to be humble yet courageous, religious yet capable of violence, obedient yet decisive in battle, compassionate yet strong enough to enforce the order's authority. Balancing these contradictions required maturity and self-control. Some brothers succeeded admirably, others failed. Yet those who endured years of service gradually developed something more valuable than military skill. They developed character. The order believed that true knighthood was not proven by a single battle or heroic charge. It was proven by a lifetime of faithful service. And for those who persevered through every hardship, temptation, and sacrifice, the final transformation was complete. They had become full Teutonic knights in every sense of the word.